last time I had a whole hour to speak about things that I really enjoy talking about. So just for that alone, thank you very much. So for those of you, well, she already kind of told you a little bit about my background, but I'm basically a psychologist, and I have a real interest in brain imaging, kind of trying to combine behavioral and imaging methods to understand how people create and how they appreciate the products of the creative process. So it just so happened that when I was in graduate school, my graduate supervisor was Colin Martindale, and I had a massive interest not only in creativity, but also in aesthetics, which tends to be a unique combination to have in the same lab. So I really kind of benefited as a result of its real encouragement early on in my career to look at both sides of the coin. Okay? So this is basically an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. I kind of want to give you a sense of where I'm going so you can kind of walk this journey with me. So first I want to convince you that the literatures on aesthetics and creativity have really sort of grown separately. So a lot of the people in this room whom you'll see around you kind of tend to do work mostly in aesthetics or creativity, but very few people kind of do work in both areas. And I think this situation can probably be ameliorated. Okay? Then what I want to do is I want to review some of the models that are already out there that link creativity to aesthetics. So I've been thinking about this question for a very long time, but there's certainly been lots of other people who've actually proposed very, very nice models. Some of the models look at sort of short-term trends in terms of how a creator interacts with the viewer, and some of the other models have sort of examined how you've got this nice large time scales of time where creators will be producing various kinds of works in specific genres, and how you've got genre changes as a function of how people appreciate the products that they produce. Okay? Then I'm going to be talking about some of the experimental work that we've done recently, looking at some of the nuts and bolts of this association to try and sort of understand whether there's a way to actually track this with data. And then I'm going to end by introducing a little model that we've been sort of working with a few of us together. It's a value transmission model. So the idea here being that there's actually a mechanism in the brain that can facilitate the transfer of how you evaluate a work from a creator to a receiver. And that could be one of the bases for the connections that we see between aesthetics and creativity. Okay? So, and then of course I'm going to end with open questions, because at the end I can assure you there'll be more open questions than at the beginning. Okay, so this is a little graph here to show you how the trends in the literature have sort of evolved over time. So the green line that you see there are studies that have been done from a creativity perspective looking at art. And then the red line are the profile of studies that have looked at aesthetics and art. And you can see there's been a very healthy growth in both of these trends over the last maybe 20 or 25 years. The tiny little line that you see at the bottom are the studies that have combined aesthetics and creativity within the same design to kind of try and understand how the creative process relates to aesthetic appreciation across different kinds of domains. As you can see, there's been very little growth in that tiny little line. And hopefully I'm going to convince you that this could really change with the work that we do. Okay, the most important thing to remember that's going to permeate throughout my entire talk today is this idea that you can think of art as a communication device. Okay, so this idea in itself is in fact very old. It's been proposed by lots of other people in the past. The basic idea here is that a creator is never creating in a vacuum. So a person creates an artwork with a particular audience in mind. Okay? Now, through that lens, you can think of the artwork as some kind of a medium through which a message is communicated from a creator to a receiver. Okay? And kind of this particular insight can really inform how you frame your studies and what you're looking after in the course of your studies. There's a little code here that I have, maybe a little shorter than the Fechner code that was introduced yesterday, but I'm going to read it for you anyway, and let's see what Helmut thinks about it. So this one says, this was done by Melissa Doletsky and Aaron Coswell, and it was published in the Psychology of Aesthetics, Creativity, and the Arts. So it indicates that engaging with art yields the natural consequence of attempting to make meaning, a type of meaning construction or imaginative storytelling in which viewers speculate about what the artist intended to communicate via the piece or try to locate themselves within the piece. In other words, if you happen to go to a museum, you're standing in front of a painting, not only are you going to be responding to the perceptual features of the painting, but you're going to try and glean something about the idea that underlies the work of art. And you kind of are having a communication with the creator via the artwork. Okay? Now, a person who's been very, very influential, also kind of maybe sort of on the periphery of this work, but has influenced a lot of thinking, is of course Ellen Dissanayake. So she is an anthropologist, okay, and she has done some really, really fantastic field work looking at the development of art in various kinds of cultures throughout the world. And she kind of has coined this very interesting term that I like, which she calls artification. So artification essentially involves taking some kind of an object and making it aesthetically pleasing. Okay, so this is something that she's noticed is a behavior that is exhibited by almost every single culture that she's looked at. And what artification will do is it can actually then be incorporated in various kinds of human rituals. Okay, and what rituals serve to do is they reinforce human bonds and they facilitate interpersonal interaction. So at the bottom of it all, what's really driving all of this is strengthening the social bonds that we have, using art as a communication medium, okay? Now, I promised to review a few psychological models that are already out there for you to get a sense of what's been done so far. So this is an older model. It goes back to 1990. It was proposed by my graduate supervisor, Colin Martindale. And this one looks at how art is changing over long expanses of time. And the idea that Colin had was that if you're an artist working within a particular medium, what you really need to do is you need to attract the attention of your audience. Okay? So in the old terminology, this was referred to as arousal potential. So what you're really trying to do is you're trying to increase the arousal level of the audience that you're interacting with. And there are all kinds of different ways to do this, but probably one of the easiest ways would be to actually increase the novelty of your work. So artists within any particular genre are producing progressively more novel works, because as soon as the work is no longer novel, you lose your audience, okay? So it's a real pressure to be novel in thinking. And of course, everybody who does work in any kind of creative medium would really understand this. But there's also a second process going on, which is this very interesting interplay between secondary process and primary process cognition. So it's a very old psychodynamic idea. You can think of primary process cognition as cognition that's associative and dreamlike. Okay? So not only is the person pushing for novelty, but within each genre, the works are also becoming progressively more associative, because the greater increase in association allows creators to be freer in combining ideas to produce additional novelty. But of course, this can only go so far. You get to a point where the work is so novel and the person has become so associative that the work is no longer coherent. Okay, so within a particular set of rules, your audience no longer understands what's happening. So what you then have is you change the rules. You have a genre change, okay? And that is a definition of a genre based on this model. So Colin was able to show through some absolutely beautiful modeling done on super old classic computers in the 70s and 80s, with data that he could find, that he could use this model to predict artistic change in literature. Of course, his favorite area of work was poetry. He looked at Western visual art, fashion, and you see a very typical pattern that resembles this like across all of these areas. Okay? So this idea essentially being that as a creator, you're interacting with an audience. Of course, you've got many creators in the same genre interacting with many members of the audience, but the feedback from them pushes you to increase your novelty level. This model is significantly newer. It's from my really good friend and colleague, Stephen Brown from McMaster University. So this was really influenced by blind variation selective retention models. The idea here is that what artists tend to do is they create what he refers to as cultural variants. You can think of a cultural variant as a work of art. So you create a work of art, you feed it to, now he uses the term consumer, okay? Because this perspective is very much influenced by the design literature, okay? So you create a particular variant, you feed it to a consumer, the consumer either likes it or doesn't like it, and the feedback from the consumer to the creator influences what the creator will then make. So you've got this very nice iterative process where individual makers are interacting with individual viewers, and clusters of makers are getting feedback from clusters of consumers, okay? So again, a very evolutionary model. In this sense, it's very similar to what Colin had produced, but a little bit more contemporary. Okay, so the model that Rebecca talked about yesterday is the one that I'm particularly partial to. I've been a fan of this model for a very long time. It's Pablo Tinio's mirror model of art, okay? So the difference between this model and the ones that I've talked about so far is that the other two that I've talked about kind of look at large expanses of time when creators are interacting with a very large set of audience members. This one is really about how a specific creator works through stages of art and then interacts with a specific perceiver. So Pablo had this really interesting insight that if you look at the literature on visual art, what you can see is that when people create visual artworks, they kind of go through three different stages. So the very first stage is the one that he called initialization. So this is when the person, for example, has a particular idea in mind that they're trying to communicate. So for example, you can think of Picasso painting Guernica. Of course, it sort of happened against the backdrop of the Spanish Civil War and the bombings in the Basque Country. He was trying to make an artwork that was going to be an anti-war statement. So that's kind of like the idea that propelled him to do the work. Now then what you have to do is you kind of have to translate this idea into a visual form. I'm going to come back to this later because it's actually very hard to do. You've got some kind of an abstract concept that has to be visualized. So that ends up framing what he called the underdrawing of that first state. So the artist has an idea, translates that into an abstract visual form that's then incorporated into the work, and that's what you call the underdrawing. Okay? In the next second stage, you expand on that. So for example, you can add components to your artwork, you can add all kinds of features and so forth, you can work on the geometry of the art. And then in the final and third stage, you do all the finalizing. So you add texture, you add color, there's all kinds of luminous features you can play with. So the artwork goes from initialization to some kind of expansion, and eventually it's finalized. Okay? Now, when viewers interact with the artwork, they go through the exact same three stages, but in opposite order. Okay? So you first come across a painting at the museum, you're kind of, this is exactly what Helmut talked about yesterday, right? So you're kind of struck by the perceptual features of the artwork. You notice the colors, you notice texture, you notice luminance, what you would kind of refer to perhaps as like superficial perceptual aspects of the work. Then once you've done that, you can start looking at some of the structural features of the work. You can look at objects within the work, how the artwork is representing things that you're supposed to pay attention to, what Paul Locker would have called weighting features. You put things in the artwork that attract the viewer's attention in very specific ways. Now, if you're very successful in your interaction with the artwork, you finally make it to the third and final stage, which is meaning making. Okay? So what happens there is that ultimately at the final point, you make contact with the original idea that really propelled the work to begin with. So you can sort of see how, if this model works in the way that Pablo had proposed, there is real communication of an idea between a creator and a receiver. And it doesn't really matter when the receiver looks at the artwork. You can walk into a museum hundreds of years later, you can interact with an artwork, but if you make contact with the idea that propelled it in the first place, you essentially have an example of successful communication. There's of course going to be a lot of individual differences. We're all impacted differently by the artworks that we look at. We bring a lot to the situation, but this is the interplay, okay? So, having looked at this model and have becoming very enamored by it, we essentially decided to do a bunch of studies to kind of like test some of the nuts and bolts of the model, okay? Fantastic. So there were two things we decided to do. Number one of the things that I talked about already in terms of mirror model of art is that, so Pablo had talked about how the perceptual features of the artwork change. So you start from a very abstract palette, it's expanded and eventually becomes finalized. Okay? So if there's a way to actually track the perceptual features of artworks, you should be able to see that change happening in the course of the painting being produced. Okay? As it so happens, we cannot do this quite well because there are all kinds of low-level visual image statistics that we can calculate. So what I'm trying to say by that is, say you were really interested in measuring complexity, what we would have done a number of years ago was that, for example, we'd have panels of experts who would look at an artwork and give you some kind of a complexity score. But now you can actually feed these images into software that's been developed that can give you a computational measure of exactly where it is that you're looking at. And I'm going to give you some examples of that. So based on this perspective, you should be able to see, for example, changes in complexity in the course of a painting being developed. Okay? Of course, viewers should also be sensitive to a work nearing completion. So if you had any kind of way to track what a person is working on from the beginning to the middle to the late stage, viewers should be able to detect that change as it's kind of progressing through the 3 levels. Okay? And then the third thing that was perhaps of most interest is that the preference that people exhibit for the artwork that they're looking at should be highest for the final version. Okay? And this one, of course, comes from Paul Locker's visual rightness theory. So I don't know how many of you may be aware of Paul Locker's work, but he was really a visionary in this field. Unfortunately, he passed away recently. He's done some of probably the most classic eye tracking work that's ever been done in empirical aesthetics. He was really a wonderful gentleman too. So what Paul surmised is that when a person is working on a work of art, when does the artist decide that the work is done? Okay? So the way to think about this, you can sort of think of yourself as a scientist who's falsifying a hypothesis. So you can think of every iteration of your artwork as a new hypothesis. So when you look at that iteration, you try to falsify that. What I mean by that is you try to replace it by something that's better. Okay? Now, you can continue along that process until you hit the point where the hypothesis that you have can no longer be falsified. In other words, there is no other version that's going to be better than the present version, at least from your own perspective. And that's where you stop. And that particular version is the one that Paul referred to as the visually right version. Okay, so a whole bunch of people, including people in our lab, we've done some work on this, trying to see whether you can kind of really test this model. And the way these models are typically tested is that you look at the final version of artworks, and then you present people with kind of alternative versions of the same artworks that have the same element, but in different compositional integrations. You can see some examples of them down here. And you ask people which version they like more, or which version they find is more balanced, for example. So a lot of this literature has shown that naive people who have no training in visual art, looking at the original version versus the altered version, tend to like the original version that the artist decided was the final version. In other words, there's something about this being visually right. Okay? So similarly, if this is true, the final version of the work that a person has been working on should be the one that's preferred most by people that view all versions. Now, there's a very interesting study that was published a few years ago by Christopher Reddy, so he's at the University of Vienna, who kind of preempted what we were going to do, but with like slightly different stimuli. So Chris is, of course, is a psychologist that does a lot of really, really good work in perception. And of course, he has done some really important work in calculating some of those low-level visual image statistics that I've talked about before. So he looked at the literature and he was able to find 2 lithographs by Picasso. The one that you see on the left is Dauphin and the one on the right is Touro. So these are really rare examples of an artist's work through the stages that he went through until it was finalized. He looked long and hard in the literature and he was only able to find 2 of them. Now, if you look at the one on the left, Dauphin, you can sort of see that it's becoming progressively more complex. Picasso is adding progressively more elements to the work until the final version. So you would expect complexity to go up. If you look at the version on the right, it's sort of like a reverse pattern where he starts fairly dense and complex and is reducing a lot of it. Because as you know, Picasso was really fond, especially towards the end of his career, to look at perceptual essentials. So the idea was that you have some kind of an image and you reduce it to its absolute essential elements to communicate the gist of what you're trying to do. And as you can see there, if you look at the graph in the middle, these are essentially complexity ratings for different stages of those artworks. And as you can see, for Touro, it's going down, whereas for Dauphin, it's going up exactly as you predict it to be. Now, of course, Chris wanted to look at more versions than just these 2 lithographs, but he couldn't find anything else in the literature. So what he did, which I think is very, very clever, he created his own paintings. So he became sort of like a scientist turned into an artist. He created this beautiful series of non-representational works that is now shared because I'm actually going to do some work with them. And he was able to show that this is not only true for Picasso's work, but also true for his own work, which he found very pleasing. Now, we wanted to look at more versions of these things, and I can tell you it's very, very difficult to find stimuli in the literature because people typically have not recorded stages of the work. All you really see is the final product. Then we hit a gem. So I go to the Toronto Public Library very often. It's very close to where I live. It's basically a 15-minute walk. And I came across this incredible documentary that was released in 1956 where Picasso allowed a French documentarian, Henri-Georges Clouzot, to go into his atelier for a few days and film him while he's painting. Okay, so some of the, it's a really incredible, like if you have any kind of interest in how artists work, it's like essential viewing. It's not very long, it's about an hour and a half long. I tried to watch this with my kids, they were not interested, so I mostly watched it with my, with my wife. So some of the images are sort of like this, where you see Picasso painting, because you sort of want to get a sense of exactly how it is that he's producing different kinds of work. But as it so happens, the overwhelming majority of the film is he had this like very interesting contraption set up behind a translucent screen, where he's filming what Picasso is painting without any kind of occlusion from Picasso. So you've got these beautiful blank canvases that develop into complete works of art. It's just stunning to watch. Some of them are very short, and he completes them. Picasso did some of his work very, very quickly, maybe like under 2 minutes. Some of them go on for over 10 minutes. There's a lot of variability in how long it took him to do this. But he produces 20 different artworks, which is incredible. And then these are examples. So we digitized everything, and then you can sort of see these are 3 different artworks that have gotten like early, intermediate, and late stages that were basically, these are like snippets from the movie at specifically specific relative times in the course of their production. And you can see them kind of as they progress from the beginning to the end, okay? So we said, okay, fantastic. So we've got 20 different artworks, all by Picasso. They can all be digitized. We can actually calculate low-level visual statistics, and of course we calculate many of them, and we can see whether they change in the predicted fashion, okay? That was going to be experiment number 1, okay? So it's an experiment completely done based on the low-level visual image statistics that were computed. I'm only going to be talking about complexity because that's the one that we cared about the most, but of course they computed many others. Now, I really want to encourage people who are here who have an interest in creativity, aesthetics, or as artists who want to actually calculate these low-level visual image statistics. There's a wonderful free online tool called the Aesthetics Toolbox. It was developed at Jena. The person who wrote all the code for it primarily is Christopher Reddy's. And what you can do is, once you've got any digitized image, you can feed it into the software, and it gives you in these beautiful, beautiful spreadsheets all the computational values for any kind of parameter that you're interested in. Okay, so for example, you want to calculate color palette, it will do that for you. That you want to look at complexity, it will do that for you. For example, you can look at self-similarity. How similar are particular sections of the artwork to other sections in the artwork? And all of these things can be used to predict things that you really care about, such as aesthetic preference. Okay? And then of course the second experiment what we did was we presented all of these different versions of the artworks to University of Toronto undergraduates to get their preference ratings and how complete they thought that particular version of the artwork was. So as you can see, as predicted, so these are the intercorrelations between all the low-level visual statistics. So this is the graph that's of most interest. You can see very, very clearly there's a linear increase in complexity as you go from early to intermediate to late stages, as the model would have predicted. And then in experiment number 2, of course, as I mentioned, every single person looked at every single image and made 2 ratings. Rating number 1 was, how much do you like this painting? And rating number 2 was, at which stage of completion do you find this painting to be? Is it early, intermediate, or late? And what you can find is that, as predicted, there's a very clear increase in completeness ratings as people go from early to intermediate to late. The same is true for preference ratings. So as people look at later stages of the same artwork, they tend to find that it's aesthetically more pleasing, they like it more. And most importantly, there's a very clear relationship between how complete they find the work to be and how aesthetically pleasing they think it is. Okay? So in other words, this intuition that Pablo had really was right, that there's some kind of a really tight coupling between aesthetic preference and the stage of the work at which point an audience member interacts with the artwork. Okay? So now we're going to change gears, and we're going to talk about this other thing that I've been really obsessed with, which is architecture. Okay, so as some of you might know, I'm really interested in architecture and design. It's been sort of a lifelong interest. And I've had the real pleasure of working with many people in this room on various kinds of projects that I'll talk about today. Okay, so I want to introduce this incredible place where amazing work happened called IPAR. Okay, so IPAR stands for Institute for Personality Assessment and Research, and it was this absolutely groundbreaking idea that was established in 1949 at the University of California in Berkeley by none other than Donald McKinnon, who's an absolute legend in the field of creativity studies. So the idea behind IPAR was, let's set up an institution where we get the brightest people together to study how creative minds work. Okay, it's kind of like a dream place to work. Okay, it was established in 1949. It started fully functioning in the 1950s. It ran through the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and it was eventually translated into IPSR, which still exists at the University of California, Berkeley. Okay. Yeah, so this is a really beautiful image of kind of the early staff at IPAR. And the person you see in the middle is none other than Ravenna Helson. Okay, I don't know if you know Ravenna, she's an absolute legend in the field. She's the one who ran this incredible study looking at creative women writers in the course of their careers. Her longitudinal study ran for 50 years. So she tracked really young creative writers in college and tracked them in the course of their lives to look at different developmental trajectories of creativity over a person's lifetime. I had the incredible pleasure of actually meeting her in person. I don't think I was able to utter 2 sentences. I was so overwhelmed meeting her. But she's a real legend to many. So here she is with the IPAR staff. So they essentially made a list of people whom they really wanted to study, people who are obvious topics of study, if you care about creativity. They thought about writers, poets, mathematicians, space scientists, and they had this incredible program where IPAR paid for all of these highly creative people to fly to Berkeley, spend an entire week at Berkeley while they were being tested on a whole bunch of different measures. Some of the measures are already available, some of our old and stuffy IQ measures, you could already get them in the 1950s, but they came up with a whole bunch of brand new measures because we didn't have a lot of good measures in the 1950s, and they developed them all at IPAR. So I, of course, really care about the architecture data, and there's an incredible book that was done by my friend and architect Pierluigi Serrano that was published in 2016. It's an absolute fantastic, I think it's the best description of just the architecture part. So if you care about IPAR work more globally, there's other stuff I can recommend for you. If you care about architecture, this is the book to go for, okay? And this study was really unique for a whole bunch of different reasons, but I've got 3 reasons here for you to see. Number one is that the people who were studied were absolute legends of the field. They basically made a list of who they thought were the most prominent architects in North America, wrote to all of them, and individually invited them to come, okay? Which is very rare in our field. And of course, a lot of people accepted, okay? Some people declined. Frank Lloyd Wright didn't have time to go. And the letter in which he declined is actually framed there somewhere, which is really interesting to see. Now, the assessments were extensive. So every single person, they asked the editors of the top journals in the field, 4 or 5, to rate every single person on creativity. Then I had this amazing panel of experts in architecture and design who rated everyone on creativity. And my favorite part is they asked every single person within the sample to rate everyone else in the sample. And what's really great about this particular one, and of course you wouldn't be surprised if you were a psychologist, was that every single person rated themselves typically in the top 3, which I love. I don't know how it's possible. For example, you look at Louis Kahn and Eroset and you think somehow that you're better, but people really did, you know? And so these are, you know, some of the, you know, if you have any interest in architecture, you know all of them. You know, Louis Kahn, Philip Johnson, Eros Saarinen, I.M. Pei. I.M. Pei was the very last member of this group to pass just a few years ago. Okay, you may not know them, but you will know the works. So this is the Salk Institute, this is the TWA terminal in New York, this is the new addition to the Louvre, and of course Philip Johnson's really famous AT&T building. So all of these are iconic designs that you would recognize. They're just, you know, I mean, speaking of art, what else gets better than this? Okay? Now, they also, so these are the ratings that I've already talked about, a lot of other measures. Now, I wrote to IPAR because I'd heard about this study from my graduate supervisor. Colin talked about this study all the time. No one quite knew what had happened to the data. So I got in touch with IPAR a few years ago, and I had to write a formal proposal, and I got permission to access their archives. Okay, so all the archives used to be at Berkeley before, but have now all been moved to Richmond. And if you submit a formal proposal and get permission, you can go to the archives and access all of this data. They literally you can walk into different rooms that were done for different sorts of studies. You can pull out boxes for specific individuals, and all of their test scores are there. Okay? It's a treasure trove of that. And I don't think any study of this kind will ever be done. It's absolutely unique. Okay? So we were lucky because what happened was, around 2006, 2007 was the 150th anniversary of the American Institute of Architects. Okay, and of course AIA wanted to really promote architecture in North America. So what they did was they ran this massive survey about which buildings people like. Okay, they literally called it America's Favorite Architecture. Okay, they sort of went out there and they did two different surveys. One of them was a survey of over 2,000 people where they showed them a whole bunch of buildings and they asked them to generate likability ratings for how much they like them. And then they also went to members of AIA. So remember, these are domain experts, right? These are like actual members of this association. And they were able to list up to 20 buildings that they thought they were essentially their favorite buildings of all time in North America. So you've got these really, really large samples telling you essentially the same thing from two different perspectives. Okay, so what this enabled us to do, because we had all of the creativity ratings from the architects from the 50s and 60s, and how much they are liked 50 years later, we were able to test whether the creativity of the architects in the 50s and 60s predicted the popularity of their work 50 to 60 years later. And it's a very interesting association to test, because it essentially enables to see whether when a person is being perceived as creative now, does that tell you anything about the aesthetic preference that people will have for their work many, many decades later? Okay, so that's like a classic creativity aesthetics association link. And amazingly, we found that it is. So regardless of whether you're looking at editors of architecture journals' ratings of creativity, or their own self-ratings of creativity, or the ratings that were given to them by a panel of architecture experts, all of those ratings predict the likelihood that their buildings will be on this list 50 years later. Another way to look at this is to see whether for architects who are and are not on the list, there were differences in creativity in the 50s and 60s. Of course, that's also true. Okay? In other words, this gave us a huge amount of motivation to look at this further, because we thought, oh my God, there's probably some kind of a signal that's communicated through the work that can actually offer you some kind of insight about the creativity of the person who produced it, which I think is an amazing finding, okay? Indra, how are we doing for time?
You're doing great. I would say another 10 minutes and then we can have some questions.
Yeah. I can't finish everything in 10 minutes, but I can finish the part I really, no. I think 10 minutes is fine. This is the part I really wanted to cover, okay? So, another amazing piece of data we came across at IPAR was based on what's referred to as the mosaic construction task. So remember, all of these architects have come to IPAR, they're given a whole bunch of classic psychometric tests of creativity and so forth, but what the IPAR architects really wanted to also look at was they wanted to look at their creative design abilities, okay? So no test actually existed at that time. So they designed this totally beautiful task where all of these architects, and I've got these beautiful pictures to show you how these rooms were set up. So if the person was brought into a room, they were provided with a very specific grid on which they could use different kinds of mosaics from different kinds of color palettes to create a design of their own liking. The instructions were kept to an absolute minimum to really allow ideation, so the architects could sort of do what they wanted to do. Everyone used a consistent set of colors, so you can look at, for example, color choices, so forth and so on. And at the time, after all of these mosaic designs were done, a group of experts in architecture and design rated all of them on overall artistic merit, good use of color, good use of form, originality, warmth, complete. But of course, these are things that you can also collect now. Okay, so I want to give you a sense of things that they made. So this was made by Philip Johnson. This was made by my favorite, Louis Kahn. I'm assuming it's also Angela's favorite. This is by Ian Pei. It's beautiful, beautiful stuff to look at, you know? So what's really nice about these mosaics is that, of course, you can do what I mentioned to you before. You can calculate low-level visual statistics. You can see whether there's some kind of a perceptual feature of these works that may or may not lead to how much artistic merit is given to them, and that's true, but that's not the part I'm going to be talking about today. What I'm going to be talking about today is we wanted to show these to undergraduates now, okay? And from each undergraduate looking at these mosaics, we collected 2 ratings, which are the key things that we really care about. Number 1, how much do you like what you're looking at? So some measure of aesthetic preference. Number two, how creative do you think the maker is? Okay, so the idea here being that when a person looks at a mosaic now, remember these were produced many, many years ago, and a person gives you some sense of how much they like it, that is going to be a very close coupling between that and how creative they think the maker is, or how creative they think the work is, okay? Now, the two images I have at the bottom is that, if you remember, the examples that I showed you before are a little old and dated. The photographs are not very good. This is all we could get. But we contacted IPAR and we got all the color codes for the original mosaics that were used back in the 1950s and 60s, and we recreated everything in MATLAB from scratch. So for every original image, we have now a duplicate, but this one has completely uniform properties for any kind of analysis you would wish to do. If anybody here ever wants to look at them and wants to use them for studies, I'll be very, very happy to share them with you, so you can let me know. So every person goes in, so every person looks at these. Again, how much do you like this mosaic design, and how creative is the maker of this mosaic design? And look, there is a very clear association between how much you like something and how creative you think the maker is, okay? So again, this intuition that when you're looking at artworks, you can think about this about artworks in almost any kind of domain. It's not just the aesthetic features that you're paying attention to initially, but you could be making all kinds of inferences about the creativity of the maker, which wouldn't surprise anybody here who's interacted with art, because we do this almost intuitively, okay? Very good. This will take me about 2 minutes. So, I mentioned earlier that I was going to be talking about this new model that we produced. It's kind of like a value transmission model, okay? So I have this little image up here. This is a model that was produced, well, it was published last year by Marcos Nadal and Martin Sko. Many of you would know who they are. They kind of have this model for sensory evaluation. It's kind of consistent, broadly speaking, with many of the models that have come before. So Helmut talked about his model yesterday. There's a model that Oshin and I put together a few years ago called the aesthetic triad. The idea here being that when people look at artworks, they make evaluations, okay? So Martin and Marcos argued that the principal part of the brain that really drives these evaluations is the brain's reward system, okay? Now, of course, this will not surprise you, because the brain's reward system, we have this term called the common currency hypothesis, has been shown to respond to artworks that you prefer, architecture that you find beautiful, faces that you find attractive, erotic images that you want to look at longer, flavors that you prefer. So it's basically a reward computation hub in the brain. Of course, the reward computation hub is not working on its own. There's all kinds of input into it. So there's a lot of input coming from the sensory perceptual system. There's a lot of input coming in from like executive higher order systems in the brain that, for example, encode things like culture and society and your experience and formal training. All of these are infusing the reward system with information which modulate what you psychologically experience. So saying that the reward system is sort of the central hub is not the same thing as saying that when you find architecture beautiful, it's the same thing as when you prefer a painting. The psychological experience is different, but underneath it all is a reward system that's contributing to all of it. And of course, the other thing I also want to mention, which is kind of in some ways a unique feature of this model, is that they really made a point of also informing the reader that some of our very basic physiological systems like homeostasis also contribute to this. So for example, you can think of art as a means for emotion regulation, because that taps into the body's physiological system, has a very important role to play in homeostasis. So all of these combined give you an aesthetic experience that can vary, okay? Now, so almost everybody would agree that this is probably mostly accurate. So we've done a whole bunch of meta-analysis of the literature on neuroaesthetics, and of course the reward system is very, very often activated. So that part is not controversial. But there were a series of studies that have been published over the last 2 or 3 years that have had a massive, massive impact on my thinking about creativity. So this is work that's been coming out of Emmanuel Voll's lab. I unfortunately don't have the time to go through the details of that, but essentially what they did is they had a very interesting intuition where they had people engage in different kinds of creativity tasks, and not only did they collect originality ratings of things that people came up with, or adequacy ratings, because remember, we typically define creativity in terms of novelty and usefulness, but they also ask people how much they like the ideas that they've produced. Okay? This, I think, is a very, very important insight that adds something really deep to how people actually engage in creative behavior. Because when we're being creative, we're typically assessing ideas that we come up with. Some of them we do based on quote-unquote rigid criteria like novelty and adequacy, but we also have a liking component that comes into play that can actually play an important role in how we continue thinking through iterative cycles. And the model in its core is this. This is the value transmission model. So on the right side, you've got, it's basically a meta-analysis. I could have put many, many different kinds of images. They all essentially have the same result, where for aesthetic evaluation, you see various regions in the brain that are part of the reward system, the valuation system, that are engaged. So what I like about this one is that it looked at reward coming from various kinds of modalities, so vision, auditory, so forth, and it kind of like all zooms into the same system in the brain. Now, what you see on the left here is this really interesting finding that comes out of the series of studies that I mentioned coming out of Emanuel Voll's lab, where you've got also engagement of the same valuation system in a course of people evaluating how much they like the ideas that they came up with. Okay? So in other words, valuation is not only important when you're aesthetically appreciating a work of art, but it also plays an important role when you're creating ideas that could lead to artistic products that other people might appreciate. And the intuition that we have is that because both of these processes to a certain extent activate the underlying common reward system in the brain, that the reward system in the brain might be providing some kind of a signal that might facilitate this interplay between creator and perceiver. Okay? It's not the same thing as saying that the reward system in the brain drives what's going on. It's not the same thing as saying that it's the only thing that matters. But because it's involved in evaluating products and ideas across a whole spectrum of domains, it could potentially play an important role in how the mind of a creator and the mind of a receiver might communicate. Lots of outstanding questions. One of the first ones actually that I've had lots of conversations with Anjan with is, what is the process whereby some of the ideas that we have that are represented in linguistic form not only are translated into the visual domain, but a perceiver interacting with them in the visual domain can infer about the original linguistic domain. It is very interesting intermodality interplay. The second one is something that Ed talked about yesterday, about this idea of shared versus unique taste. So if you're going to argue that the communicator is somehow able to interact with the perceiver, there has to be some aspect of taste that's shared. There has to be a common language, some kind of symbolic language that both parties share, in the absence of which communication will be impossible. Of course, there can still be lots and lots of individual differences, but something shared has to be there to enable this model to make sense. Okay? The third thing are some of the other factors, including contextual and social factors, that can modulate the functioning of the reward system. This is something we don't really know much about at the moment, but I think it's a very important area of study. And something else, which of course Soma talked about yesterday, is what are some of the common and unique predictors of aesthetics and creativity. So I've sort of argued that there is something inherently related between the creative process and the aesthetic process. Of course, not everything is the same. They're really different activities. Okay, but we kind of need to understand what's common between them and what dissociates them to have a fuller understanding of exactly what these two processes are and how they're interconnected. And on that note, I'm going to end. Thank you very much for your attention.